Well, today on the Yarn, we've got Jonathan O'Brien from the Yes in My Backyard movement, or YIMBY movement, and Jonathan is running the Melbourne office of the YIMBY scheme here in Australia, in Melbourne. So, how are you, Jonathan?
Yeah, good. Careful calling us a scheme. People will get ideas.
Well, you're a scheme that's about trying to support young people, so maybe we'll find a better name for that. But now, why don't you tell me a bit about, for the uninitiated, tell me a bit about YIMBY and how you got involved.
Yeah, sure. So I was really just running politics in the pub about 18 months ago. And, we were sitting around talking about politics.
Yeah.
And I get itchy just talking about things. And sat there in the room, we sort of tried to find, well, what's the nexus of things that we care about? And fundamentally, it was housing. I mean, it's housing for all young people across Australia at the moment. But yeah, at our table, we had, people who'd been homeless, whose, parents had really struggled, been hit by financial shocks, and just the lack of housing supply was so abundantly clear. And one of the things that we sort of all agreed on was that it was something we could really make a difference on at a local level. And we could see what would happen if we started going to council meetings and then tried to scale our impact. And now here we are 18 months later, and I think we've very much succeeded in scaling that impact.
So, what I'm trying to understand is, where did this YIMBY movement first initiate? Where did it actually start?
Yeah, it starts in the most unequal place on earth, which is San Francisco. So a city which is really plagued by some of the most restrictive housing, zoning regulations in the world.
Right.
But also the place, of course, where all of our biggest and most wealth-producing tech companies are all based. So you see this enormous inequality, people who can't afford homes and the inability to build any more of them. So San Francisco kind of becomes ground zero for this movement to go, well, wait a minute, why can't we build apartments for tech workers? Why can we only live in single-family homes sort of in the middle of, one of America's most productive areas?
Yeah.
And so as a result, it really grows out of there. And now there's movements all around the world, Britain, Australia, sort of across Europe.
Ironically, San Francisco has a lot in common with Melbourne and Sydney, doesn't it? Because it's got that Victorian
Yeah.
era style townhouse or terrace style housing, medium
Terrace
density.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of parallels. And look, we imported most of our planning scheme from America. And, those planning schemes are rooted in the ideas of either keeping poor people out of suburbs or sort of commercial rent seeking. These planning schemes, people say it's mostly about separating incompatible land uses. That's what sort of is the gist. Don't put a glue factory next to a childcare. And I agree, maybe don't put a glue factory next to a childcare. But you can solve that with business permitting. And you certainly don't solve that by micromanaging the way that we build homes on land. An incompatible land use is not a single family house next to an apartment. That doesn't strike me as inappropriate or worth kind of putting up a whole bunch of barriers when we know that the benefit of delivering more housing supply is just unequivocally the way that we solve this crisis.
Okay, so YIMBY kicks off in San Francisco and then it comes to Melbourne and Sydney. So what are the main activities of the Melbourne chapter?
Yeah, sure. So we have really three prongs to our approach. So the first is kind of bread and butter, going to local council meetings, making sure that there's a voice in the room for the biggest stakeholder in a new housing project, which is the people who want to live somewhere but can't, right?
Yeah.
Right now, we have a system that's set up to kowtow to a small number of very vocal NIMBYs, generally older, generally wealthier, generally whiter, generally kind of semi-retired people who really understand this bureaucratic planning system that is sort of purposefully obfuscatory. So that's our bread and butter, is kind of going and reminding councillors
So number one is
that
you
there are
actually
other
turn up
voices.
at the council meetings. So number one is you actually turn up, right?
Correct. Actually turning up.
Okay.
And that's the thing. People are shocked. So that was a big part of how we started. Was I turned up, gave a speech, and a local paper said, oh, who was that guy who gave that speech? We haven't seen a pro-housing speech in Marybeck council chambers. He got in touch with me, asked me to turn it into an op-ed. That got picked up by The Age and everything exploded. Having a pro-housing voice and an organized pro-housing voice is so novel. It's so novel in Australia.
So that's the first thing. What are the other things?
The other things we do, digital infrastructure. So a lot of kind of collecting data, communicating that data, collecting information on how to lobby councils and so on. You know, most councils have no mechanisms for kind of notifying you, for instance, when there's a new agenda down here in Melbourne. It's very, very, very opaque. Again, there's not a lot of government transparency. And then the other thing is policy. So we do a lot of policy research down here in Melbourne. We've released our missing middle report last year. And then this year we've released a housing targets report where we looked at the cost of zoning across Melbourne and sort of generated, right, well, where's most restrictive and where should we be building homes and where can we build homes? And the way we figured that out was you work out, well, where are there super profits to be had, right? Where are the prices that a house sells for far outstripping the construction costs? And then you have to ask, well, why aren't people building there? And overwhelmingly, why wouldn't you chase something that's super viable and that would net you sort of a healthy margin? Well, the answer is sort of red tape, planning restrictions, and so on. And that's what our econometric model really showed. And then we've done some stuff on sort of trees, tree canopy, and we're working on train station ranking for upzoning now as well as a report on heritage restrictions, which of course are always hot button.
So in terms of data collection, advocacy, turning up, research, these are all things that you're doing effectively as a volunteer movement of mainly millennials and Gen Zs. Is that right?
100%. So what's really interesting is, yes, we're fully volunteer, get that out of the way.
Yeah.
And then the interesting bit is active membership, the people who are sort of volunteering on the reports and everything tend to be younger, right?
Yeah.
Because these are people who have a bit more time in their day and, you know, are still sort of have the time to put into large volunteer projects. But the interesting thing about YIMBY Melbourne's membership demographics is that we actually have around about 50% owner occupiers and around about 50% over the age of 40.
Right.
And what that indicates to us is something that seems fundamentally true, which is that parents are really worried about the future for their kids, right? We have this conservative system that forces people to live very far away from their families, their communities. We see clubs, church congregations, etc., all dwindling because the actual population able to live near there is much lower. It's mostly empty nesters. And people are waking up to that. People are waking up to the fact that we have this system of spatial regulation that is making us all poorer, pushing us further away from each other, and really fundamentally, you know, making productivity super, super slow to grow in this country.
Okay. So now there's Melbourne and Sydney. Is there Brisbane as well, or is it just Melbourne and Sydney?
There is. There's greater Brisbane.
Yeah.
There's also greater Canberra, and there's Hobart, YIMBY Hobart as well have started up, and there's talks to sort of get something going in Adelaide as well. You know, we're hoping to sort of be in each capital because I think there's the state reforms, there's the local reforms, but we also need to see leadership from the federal government on this as well.
Okay. So you've covered the East Coast. So I imagine that at the initial level, you are now introducing contestability into the judgments that councils make, that rather than a council just having to think about what might come through from a few people who are retired and maybe a bit of a petition or something from some NIMBYs, they now have to, it's now contestable, right? So you've introduced contestability. The question is, how successful has that model been so far, given it's only new?
Yeah, sure. So it's new, but down here, speaking to Melbourne, we've had a bunch of big successes.
Yeah.
So
Okay. Well, tell me about those.
our first run on the board was last year. There was going to be a heritage overlay placed on sort of more than 900 properties in Maribyrnong council area. On the back of our advocacy, as well as advocacy from people who were going to be affected by that, Maribyrnong Council actually declared that the overlay would not go ahead based on considering the financial impacts of that instrument. Now, that's not a precedent that had been set before. And we have now seen Maroondah Council and other councils cite that as a precedent when considering heritage overlays. Now, that's big because heritage has been completely unaccountable for decades. And now there is a legal precedent, or I guess not a legal precedent, but like a council precedent for considering the trade-offs. And this is the thing that planning really fails to do a lot of the time, is actually measure and consider the trade-offs of the regulations that they put on land and on property.
And what
So that's been one big win. And then
What
sort of
about
our
some
research has
development?
sort of impacted a few things here and there as well.
Yeah, and what about when a council is making a judgment about a particular development proposal? Has there been any successes there in warding off NIMBYism?
Yes, I think there have been cases. So a lot of the time, it's very easy to kind of dunk on local councillors, right? It's an easy target. But the reality is that we certainly find down here is that there are a lot of good councillors trying to do good work who simply do not have the social license to do so, to permit housing. They recognize that there's a supply shortage. They recognize that we need to build more homes where people want to live, but they just haven't had the license from their residents until we're here. So yes, there's been an incredible response. We see councillors, at meetings where we speak and meetings where we don't, where, there really is well, if we don't approve this, then what are we saying about the housing shortage? What are we actually demonstrating and signaling as our position? Because if we don't allow more people to live here, and if we push families apart, how is that good representation of the majority of our constituents?
Yeah.
So yes, we're definitely seeing a shift.
I hear you, but I mean, I have to say, I think that in relation to the local councils, I mean, they are in the hot seat, and historically they've been able to oppose development because there was no scrutiny.
That's right.
And frankly, they were just responding to the squeaky wheel principle, right? That the people who were putting, as per the reason for your organisation being established. So I do think that the councils do need to be under pressure to perform. Now you must have which councils in Melbourne are doing well?
Yeah, so we have a few councils in Melbourne that are doing well. Obviously, Melbourne City, because they're sort of able to deliver within the capital city zone. Our modeling indicates that sort of the Western councils, they don't build a huge amount of housing, but they're building around about to what we would expect demand to be. So councils like Maribyrnong, who did overturn that overlay, actually seem to be permitting around about as much housing as you'd expect. Councils like Yarra actually deliver more than you'd think, though of course there are a lot of sort of hotbed individual projects there. And the understanding is that it's a very difficult council to work with. But in terms, again, of just measuring the numbers, Yarra and Marybeck and City of Melbourne are actually doing pretty well. But it's when you kind of go into the richer, leafier east where you sort of start to
so
see.
who's on the naughty list? Who's on the naughty list?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest offender, and they won't be surprised to hear me saying this, but Burundara Council are absolutely on the naughty list.
Where's that?
So that's in the east. That's Kew, Hawthorne, and so on.
Right.
Around about 90% of their land is zoned neighborhood residential zone. So that's the lowest kind of zoning that we have in this city. It precludes. Planners will say, oh, well, it's not technically single family zoning. You can build more than one thing. It's not economically viable. It will never again be economically viable to densify on neighborhood residential zone outside of maybe some townhouses. The reality is that, Burundara are very, very cynical in the way they use the planning scheme. 34% of their residential land is heritage listed as well. It's astronomical. They heritage listed a concrete road recently. It's a deeply unserious sort of exercise.
Must be a very important road for it to have a heritage listing. Is it a particular form of concrete which they're admiring?
It's the old sort of traditional way of making roads, which was with concrete, which of course is much more expensive to maintain, has to be replaced in more expensive ways, and higher carbon inputs, higher resourcing, and of course worse and less safe to drive on.
Okay, so effectively you're organised now. This is all operating, and you are in favour of supply and development. That is your position.
That's right.
And how have you found the federal implications? I mean, what are the main things that the national government can do to support supply and development?
Yeah, one of the things that has been really kind of disappointing, I think, and surprising around the current federal government's approach is sort of two-pronged. One, that we have, Chris Minns, the Andrews, now Allen government down here, kind of fighting the good fight for planning reform. And the federal government has really been silent on that. They have a lot of levers to pull, right? You can do what we're seeing in Canada and America, which is tied grants. So, we're not going to give you XYZ infrastructure funding unless you, do what is good, which is to fundamentally, get rid of the restrictive zoning around the areas like transport, like the Todd program in Sydney and, which is kind of increasingly slowly about to start rolling out in Melbourne through the Activity Centres program. The government could have really had and should have a much stronger position on those reforms. The other thing is that the federal government, and this is not just this government, but this is the federal government generally in Australia, we are a highly urbanized country. Most of our productivity comes from 3 or 4 cities. And people are increasingly moving there. As farming becomes more automated, there are fewer people living on farms, even though farms obviously are a significant part of our GDP. The reality is that the federal government has never really had a huge interest in the urbanized nature of our country. So the National Urban Policy does represent a chance for the federal government to finally take a stake in that as an institution. Again, not as any given party. No one has done this. So we're really hoping that the National Urban Policy is, worth the paper it's written on, which, obviously remains to be seen. We've put in a large submission as part of the Abundant Housing Network Australia on that. So it's really tied grants, supporting these planning reforms either through fiscal levels or simply through political levers. I know you had Peter Tulip on your show, and he really talks about the fact that there's an education piece to be done here. Most Australians do not understand the economics of housing supply. It's obfuscated by sort of loud minority voices. And the federal government really needs to put the case forth to the Australian people that, hey, actually, one, an apartment going up next to you will raise your property prices more likely than lower it. And two, that it's going to fundamentally make things more affordable for your kids and for your family and for generations to come.
Yeah, look, I think it's difficult for the federal government to solve this problem on its own, but clearly the national government can do a number of things. I think, without being too political, I mean, the Labor government have had 2 policies on supply. One has been the housing targets. The other one has been the big fund they've set up called the Housing Australia Future Fund. I'd argue that neither of those have been successful because it hasn't been supported with any advocacy, and paying the states to build houses has not been successful thus far. So I would have thought that stronger measures would be needed if they were really serious about it. And also, frankly, everyone wants to blame Canberra for everything. So that means that the housing minister of the day has a pretty big platform. If they wanted to pursue states and even councils, if they were embracing NIMBYism. Now, I wonder whether or not there are particular incentives or whether there are coercive measures even that can be deployed here. So the New Zealanders are tying GST to councils, aren't they? I mean, are there, other than tied grants, are there any other sort of options here, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a sort of a big piece, right? So you can kind of lay out a target and say, we'll pay you, I think it's 15 grand per house, sort of in excess of some number. And the delayed nature of those grants is a problem, right? Because often you actually want to unblock the infrastructure much earlier on. And you can do that via that sort of paid bonus. But I think one of the really core things is to have a position on the way our country is planned. Have a position on the fact that, there are billions of dollars in infrastructure, energy projects, et cetera, all held up in planning departments around the country. If the federal government wants productivity to increase and wants sort of more to be done faster and more effectively in this country so that we can, fundamentally continue to prosper for the next, 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, why not? We fundamentally kind of need to have a federal government that takes like you said, takes a position, stakes advocacy. Now, I'm pretty heartened by Minister O'Neill. I think she's doing a better job than previous of a gap that Labor have really had, which is an inability to speak to the 94%, and that's the 94% of people who own, rent, or live with someone who owns or rents a home, right, off the market. There was a big failure to speak to those people. And as a result, that was filled by really kind of some populism that we've sort of seen from the Greens. And yeah, I think that was kind of a big problem. And, you know, we've had sort of you sort of on Q&A in particular, you know, really fighting the supply fight. And yeah, the fact that the government of the day has sort of only now realized that they need to pivot to talking to, you know, the majority of people who live in housing that is delivered by the market and is on the market. You know, there's a lot of catch up to do.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, that the advocacy is the key thing that the national government can apply here, given we don't run the planning system. So if you have if you're the national government and your policy is to have a housing target, which you know you'll never meet, it really weakens your position straight away, particularly if there's nothing else to complement it. So, I mean, I think that the next election will be, in many respects, the housing election, and there'll be a real test on what people can put forward as their supply policies. We all know that if you put all your policies on the demand side, you'll make the problem worse. So the question is, what can you do there? And I guess we're all looking for, we're all in the market for good ideas. It did concern me that the new minister didn't appear to commit to looking at any new policy ideas. That was indicated in some of the media statements that perhaps she wanted to just proceed with the existing policies as they are. But it sounds from what you're saying, you think that they need to change the policy as well as the communication.
Yeah, I don't think the political calculus gives them any choice not to.
Yeah.
Right. But yeah, like you're saying, I think the next election is absolutely going to be a housing election. We're banking on that even at local elections. So YIMBY Melbourne, just today, day of broadcast, have announced our Lord Mayor housing town hall. So to date, it's going to be the only time where all of the City of Melbourne Lord Mayoral candidates appear on stage together. And we're making it very explicitly about housing and about more homes where people want to live, and how the Lord Mayor is going to set that agenda for the rest of the councils and councillors all across Melbourne. I think you're right. I think we're going to see the state elections, the federal elections. These are going to be housing elections. This crisis has been decades in the making, and strong ideas to solve it are going to be really, really key. And I think that does come from the federal government taking a bit more of an interest and a bit more kind of saying, well, why do we have really discrete planning systems across our country, for instance? How is a house or an apartment or a unit particularly different in Sydney from Melbourne? Why are these systems different? Why aren't they sort of looking into like a Japanese style system where actually there's some consistency and a bit less duplication of kind of vagaries? You know, there are benefits to having kind of some decentralization. You know, an idea doesn't work here, but it might work here. Okay, great. You can borrow that and so on. But, you know, we have the National Construction Code, and that's really good because that means the thing that can get built anywhere. But then we have these planning regulations at a local level or a state level that mean that you can't actually move a design from Sydney to Melbourne. And so when everyone's talking about pattern book stuff, you want to really talk about, well, what can you build nationally and how can you make it the same everywhere so that we can actually have an industry that can deliver on land all across the country? Because it's just land. It's not, Sydney's not magical. Melbourne's not magical. I mean, they're magical cities and I love them both very much, and I love Melbourne a little bit more. But yeah, the reality is that we have this system that kind of treats everything as much more unique than it perhaps actually is.
Melbourne is a great place to visit, but as a former Victorian, I have to say that I do think Sydney gets the gold medal. But finally, can I ask you, because it is a problem that anyone can solve, isn't it? Because we've seen the Canadian Conservative Party, we've seen the New Zealand National Party adopt housing supply as a key issue. We've seen Chris Minns in New South Wales, the Labor Premier, take it on as a key issue. So the reality is that this is not about any ideology, isn't it? This is about providing the supply so the next generation have houses to live in. So frankly, anyone could be able to adopt your platform, in effect, couldn't they?
That's right. And that's reflected in both the YIMBY Melbourne executive and in our membership. So our executive has a Labor member, a Greens member, and a Liberal member, all on our executive, all working together on this shared goal. Our membership includes members of the Libertarian Party, members of the Victorian Socialists. These people come together at events and they get along because they all understand that this is not an ideological thing. This is a truth claim, right? there are not enough houses, and where we are building houses is not actually suiting our country in the best way possible. You know, we want more productive cities. We want our urban centers to be innovative, to be exciting, to be culturally vibrant. And the way you do that is not by locking people out, but by letting them in. You know, it really is kind of a tradition, I guess, of small L liberalism in a lot of ways. That's why you're seeing, you know, the likes of Obama, Kamala Harris now, Keir Starmer over in the UK, and yeah, the Conservatives over in Canada as well. You know, parties around the world who sort of embrace this kind of tradition of the open society, you know, as Karl Popper would put it, or George Soros would put it. This really kind of open, vibrant world where people have the freedom to move, the freedom to live, and the freedom to fundamentally pursue the life they want to pursue. Everyone can agree on that. It's not actually an ideological thing, not really. And the reality is that more homes where people want to live is the backbone of that.
That's right. And it is somewhat ironic that we're living in an age where fewer people join clubs and societies than ever before, right? That's why there are fewer people joining Rotary and Lions and the Labor Party and the Liberal Party. But you've organised a membership-based organisation in an age where people don't do that. So I'm an admirer of what you're doing, and I think it's very important for young people. And thank you for what you're doing. And it goes to show you can do great things from outside Parliament. Perhaps you can do more important things from outside Parliament. So on behalf of all people that want to see a sensible outcome on housing, thank you for what you're doing. And thanks for coming on the podcast today.
No, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, thank you for all the work you're doing as well. Your advocacy has been really, really strong. And I think it's great to see sort of a pro-supply, pro-density liberal leader has been really, really heartening.
Supply. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you, Senator Bragg.